Chapter 21 Mrs. Grace. Sada was conscious for those twilight moments where she was in the air, spinning. Like Sidon, she had no sense of direction, or speed, or gravity, only of turning in space. Thoughts were ethereal, fleeting things, and she could not gather herself enough to form them. It was similar to the feeling one might have on the very edge of sleep, when consciousness is slipping away but the world is not yet gone, only here it was insistent and seemed to last much longer. It did not. Of course, it only seemed that way. She only lost consciousness when her head struck the stone, and her skull shattered. Then there was darkness. Sada knew darkness. She had regained her consciousness in darkness, being called out to by the goddess in a dream, called up out of sleep. This sleep was like that one. This sleep was also death. She did not reflect upon it. She could not. But death did not mean the same thing for her that it might for others, so, too, for anyone who carried the blessing of the Zora champion, in other times or other places. She dreamed. She was back in that boundless inner void that had framed her relationship with the divine and with herself since she had been born into new memory, only now the goddess was not there. Where had Hailey gone? Did she not know Zelda was here? Did she not know how enormous, how terrible this place was without her?
Princess!
The world collapsed in on itself, Zelda's perspective condensing until it had reached a single finite point as an infinity of stars spun away into nothingness, and she became smaller and smaller, and then she was there, in the void, and Mipha was with her. Mipha's hands were on her head, and a coolness filled her thoughts.
Mipha, how are you here? What happened?
Mipha winced in an expression of sympathy, but also, was that irritation? So sharp it embarrassed her to be on the receiving end of it.
Assassins of the Yiga clan. One of them was carrying bomb arrows and exposed them to the open air when you were within range. Your armor protected you from the blast, barely, until your head struck a stone on the side of the path.
Princess, he had said, and then opened his jacket to her and invited death for them both. Yes, now she remembered.
Then I am dead. Almost.
Mipha said, and now that sympathy added color to a smile.
I caught you on the edge of death. In a moment you would have lost your life. That is the fullness of the power I have granted you. There is no blow so terrible, no cut so deep, that I cannot undo it. I will always heal your wounds.
She seemed to catch herself and blinked rapidly, though Zelda could not have guessed as to why.
That is far more than I thought you had given me, Mipha. I don't know if I even understand. Then I will explain it to you. Because you carry my power inside you, you can use it to heal others, but when the time comes and you are most in need I can take hold of it and focus all of it on you.
Now her expression was sharper, more severe.
Don't think this is limitless, Princess. It is not. Though this is my power, it is now tied to your life force, and I must use all of it to save your life. Until your life force restores it, it cannot be used in this way again. When you awaken, do not fall prey to the Yiga. I will not be able to help you. My life force. Is it tied to Hailey's power, then?
Mipha had no answer for her, but she hadn't been seeking one, she'd only been wondering aloud.
Mipha, how long will it take before it's ready again? That. Difficult to guess at. For a strong, healthy person it might take 2 or even 3 days. When I emptied my strength utterly, I could use it again after perhaps 30 hours. For you, we will not know until it has begun to recover.
She sighed, as if letting go of a breath she had been holding for long minutes.
Which will begin soon. It's time for you to wake back up, Zelda. Haya must be worried sick.
Haya. She was fighting the Yiga assassins alone. Haya could surely handle herself, but, and then, without being told, she realized that time did not pass the same way in this place. Barely a heartbeat had passed since her skull struck the rock. From the perspective of someone watching, she was about to get up nearly the same instant she had landed. Hopefully that would be fast enough.
You have been moving through your quest as a person would.
That caught her attention, Mipha's words. Not exactly carrying an edge. She wasn't sure if Mipha was even capable of speaking sharply, but meant to be heavy, admonishing.
You cannot continue to do that. I am a person.
The words were out before she had fully formed them. The idea that she had to express it was almost preposterous. But she knew where this was going, even before Mipha continued.
You are. So am I and the rest of the champions. So is Link. So, once, was Ganon. But we are all more than that, aren't we? We have to be. Even if inside of ourselves we are the same weak, frail, cowardly creatures that we were born as, even if we have never truly grown at all. Still we must be more than people.
So difficult to read her face, but the set of her eyes was clear.
100 years ago I told you that I would be there for you, that I would listen when you wanted to talk and talk when you wanted to listen, because there was common ground between us. But now you must listen, because you need the truth, and the truth is this: you, and Link, and Ganon. All of you are of a kind.
The void was cold, now.
You are a person. You have the strengths and weaknesses of a person. You have the heart of a person. But, Princess, a person cannot do what you will do. A person cannot stand against Ganon. A person cannot free the other champions or regain control of the divine beasts. A person cannot hope to survive when the entire Yiga clan seeks for their blood.
Mipha took her hands away from Zelda's temples, and despite what Mipha was saying, something in her expression made the inside of Zelda's chest quake, not out of shame or fury or fear but love. Love that was the only possible answer to the belief being invested in her now.
Though, you will be more than a person. You are a legend, and you must bear the burden of a legend. I'm sorry for it, and I would help you if I could, but I cannot. You must do this yourself. Show them. Show the world that you have the strength to play your part in this story.
3 women there were in Zelda's mind, and often she thought of them as partaking in a quiet war for the heart of her identity, the amnesiac, the princess, and the oracle of the goddess. How often she thought of them fighting, she, the amnesiac who sought to preserve her identity and her connections and her loves and her fears against those of the other 2. To be told that she could not do this, to be told that she could not preserve herself, protect herself. Something raged inside of her. She wanted to be angry, not just to scream but to lash out, not to explain but to illustrate that injustice. And it would have been foolish, she knew, to burden a dead woman with her frustrations. Foolish and small. Because she is right. Of course she is. The golden power was inside of her, and deeper than that, carried on a level so fundamental it brushed against the primordial. Something far more terrible slept. Both called out to her, both told her of the legend. She would be a part of it. Her choice was to either be run down by it or to sink her teeth into it and make it her own. The goddess had spoken to her, and Mipha had admonished her, and her father had left her with the regrets of the family she had failed. And Link fought on, and on, and on. Could she do less? But no, that was the wrong question, the wrong comparison to be made. It did not matter what Link was doing. What mattered was her answer to that question. Would she rise? Or would Ganon prevail? I cannot be 3. The power flared inside of her, the chiming of the creation bell, and that void was filled with light as life returned to her body. Her awareness reached outward, and she felt another power that might answer her call. Mipha waited in front of her, looking up at her with admiration, but not awe. It was that lack of awe, that knowledge of her essential personhood that slept beneath the roaring power of the goddess, that made her finally grasp why the champions had been so important to her.
Thank you, Mipha, for your gift. But more importantly, for talking to me. I needed to hear that.
Mipha bowed to her.
It is my pleasure.
Zelda rose up out of the darkness, buoyed by a swelling of the golden power that lifted her up into the waking world, and through the ringing of the bell and the roar of power she could hear blood pounding in her ears, and on her lips she bore a name. She rose with a shout, calling a name that was not pronounceable by the tongues of the peoples of Hyrule, for whom the Gorons and the Gerudo and the Hylians and the Zora had only ever been able to produce approximations. She did not speak with her human tongue, it was the goddess's voice that thundered. That shout was carried by a wave of the power, not so far that Ganon could hear it, but enough to be heard in the entire range surrounding Death Mountain. The owner of the name heard it, and at once they answered, Hylia. In a language that was not language, in a tongue that was older than the pact the humans had made with the gods.
Hylia.
They called again, in answer, because their pact was older by far. They twisted in the air, and the sky split, and they plunged through the rift rent wide in the blue. Hylia saw her charge, her princess, the incarnation of her goddess. And yes, the woman you love, why not add that on top of it? It's not like that could make it worse now, could it? Crash into a stone on the side of the road. She saw how Zelda's hair was still aflame, her bandana knocked loose, as the impact broke her skull and her spine. She saw the world end.
Save her, go to her, hold her, help her, stop them.
Pai's sword was alight with Hylia's blessing as she turned and struck. The motion practiced and fluid as her sword separated tendon and muscle from bone, and a second Yiga fell, howling and clutching at their leg, to join the first. The third was prepared for her. The sickle blade was already coming down, and she slammed into the weapon with her shield, blowing wide the assassin's guard. This one she didn't even have to cut. She drove the hilt of her blade into their solar plexus. The blow sharp and sudden and deep, and she heard the breath leave the Yiga before they fell to the ground, unmoving, their sickle sword clattering on the stone. Laughter, then, and lights around her. 5 more Yiga, moving as the Yiga moved, announcing themselves as a sign of their impending victory. She did not reflect on their improper form, or their arrogance, or their deviation from what the Shaker roots would have made a much more dangerous formation. She was not thinking very much at all. She moved automatically, as if dreaming, because she had shut the scream inside of her mind, and it had taken up a chamber so large that she was not able to think without it. She would disable these men and women. She would kill them, if they made her. Then she would go to Zelda. And she was wondering how long she would be screaming when the tone of Zelda's power filled the world. Golden light suffused the air as the assassins appeared, blade and bows ready, but she paid them no mind, and they likewise. Every eye was turned to the princess as she rose from her place on the ground. There was no blood on her head or in her hair. Her hair was burning, but it seemed to burn with the light of the midday sun, as if the heat of Death Mountain did not touch it. Her eyes were clear, and half-lidded, and sad. Deeply, unbelievably sad, as she looked at the assassins gathered before her. No fear, no anger, no frustration, no pain, only sadness.
Your masters have told you that you are here to kill a girl,
Zelda said in a voice that radiated from the stones and the air.
Do not move.
Zelda spoke directly into Pai's mind, and Pai's entire body tensed in answer to the impossibility of the request. Please, no matter what happens next, do not move. One of the assassins, less paralyzed than their fellows, took aim with a duplex bow and released 2 arrows. These arrows struck Zelda in the chest, and fell to the ground, their heads blunted. The princess neither looked at them nor reacted to the impact. Her armor, blessed by the great fairy, had protected her. Hadn't it? The light roared around her, and Paia wondered if it was more than the armor at work.
Only a girl.
And the words might have been spoken by the world itself. The air opened above Zelda, a disk of darkness rimmed in storm clouds widening like the spreading ripples in a pond, and from it spewed fire, and then the embodiment of fire arriving like an explosion. A serpent, head the size of a house and bearing a crown of horns that glowed with the enormity of the heat contained within them, plunged out of the rift, descending to the ground and taking its perch on the stones behind Zelda. The length of its body could have encircled every person there. The enormous claws at the end of its powerful arms could have easily crushed the boulders they were now latched around. It perched behind Zelda, as if framing her, framing the light of the world, and it lifted its head, and its crimson eyes were larger than the people at which it stared. Paia knew the spear from the stories her grandmother had told her, and she knew that its true name was for the gods, but that her people called it Dinral, the great spirit of fire, guardian of the spring of power. And Dinral had come to Zelda as if it was her guardian.
Do you believe that?
Zelda's voice did not betray the sadness in her eyes. Still, her tone was not challenging. She wanted their answer to this question. She wanted them to leave.
Do you believe that you raise your sword against a girl? A child? Do you believe that you can carry out your task?
The Yiga, for all their worship of Ganon and all the evil that they meant for the world, were themselves only people. Paia could feel their fear radiating from them in waves, could smell how it soured their sweat, hear how each of them trembled. The dragon looked down at them in ready judgment, but it was not Dinral who held them, it was Zelda, a light with the power of the goddess, who kept them arrested. Paia believed they would flee for a long, sweet moment, so long that she opened the chamber in her mind and found she was no longer screaming. She thought they would see reason and leave this place and tell the story of how Zelda had risen unharmed from their attack and called a dragon to her. It was, in the end, only a moment. One of the assassins, more zealous than the rest, gathered their courage and spoke through the mask that made their voice inhuman and strange. For Koga! And that was all it took. Voices rose up to join theirs in chorus. For Koga! the assassin whose face Paya had struck with her shield, and the one whose nose she had hammered with the hilt of her sword, both rose up, Foga's name in their mouths. Only the one whose tendons she had cut stayed on the ground, though even they called out their leader's name, Fokoga! Fokoga! They all cried out as one, and as one they moved to attack the princess. Some, holding their sickles in their hands, charged straight for her, feet beating a rhythm quicker than a bird's heartbeat. Others, holding their bows, made the signs by which they might move between spaces without being seen, seeking better vantage points by which to feather their target. As one, they sought to fulfill the wishes of their master. As one they were answered by Dinral, as one they were encompassed by the dragon's bugling roar, by the flashing of its eyes, the flexing of its power. As one they were engulfed in flames, as one they burned, and burned. The heat of the fire is so terrible that even at a space of 10 meters and guarded against the effects of flame by the elixir, Pai still covered her face with her arms. Then the heat was gone, and she looked again. As one the Yiga had disappeared, not even ashes were left behind. Aya looked past them, to Zelda, and saw that her princess had never looked away, never turned her eyes from the fury that the dragon had unleashed on her behalf. Now that sadness was joined by pain. The two of them made eye contact, and Pai thought to call out to her, but then she realized Zelda was not looking at her. She was looking at the last of the Yiga, who lay on the ground, hands wrapped around her leg, quietly gasping in panic, and sickness, and fear. Steel yourself. Take that pain and put it away, deep, deep down where you can come back to it later. Bury it, knowing that it will claw its way to the top again. They are dead. You did not kill them.
I called on Dinral, as well to have put them to the torch with my own hands. They made their choices and left you none. Yes, confront this, but not now.
The dragon lowered their massive head to her, and she reached out and ran her palm along their brow. She would have thought the touch burning, but like Nadra, Dinral betrayed expectations. They were warm, fantastically and comfortingly warm, sending waves of well-being and calm up her arm and into her chest. The guardian spirits of Hyrule radiated serenity and wholeness, she thought, and for how well it masked her pain she thought she would never take her hand from the dragon's head. "Thank you," she said, not in the tongue of the gods but in her own language. "You suffer," the dragon said, in the language that could not be reproduced by the tongue of the Hylians, which she only understood with the goddess's power and memory informing her awareness. "I wish they had not died." She did not wish that Dinral had not killed them. She would never gainsay their protection. She simply wished they had not arrived at this point. The dragon understood. Still, they were malice. That word, which she thought of as malice, did not translate perfectly into Hylian, and came bundled with hundreds of different textures. They were corrupted, of Ganon, breeding the hurt, against Hylia, authors of their own downfalls, on and on, perfectly precise in a way that made her own words seem almost crude in comparison. "Even so, thank you." She lifted her hand. Dinral lifted their head, and the wind rushed in to fill the gap as it moved. "Call on us," they said, meaning all of their kind, at any time, from any place, Hylia. Without a tremor in the earth or a single stone broken loose did Dinral rise, their bodies snaking through the air as if they were swimming. Fires plumed in the sky around them, and the wind roared, and somehow over the howling of the fires and the whirling air that sense of tranquility filled the world. She watched them for what was only a few seconds, but a few seconds was long enough. She turned back to Paya and the last of the Yiga, and she walked slowly and calmly down the trail. The power still enshrouded her, filling the world with a golden light more terrible than a dragon's, but one could hear the soles of her boots tapping against the stone as if she stood alone in an empty room. Paya was not afraid of her. She surprised herself that was the first thing she had noticed after calling on the dragon, after presiding over the elimination of the Yiga, after
rising from the dead.
She had thought the other woman would be afraid. Had she been hoping for that? Had she been hoping that seeing her as she was, according to what she could do, would change Paya's perspective of her? What cruel hope that would have been. What vain hope, too, because when their eyes met she saw only relief and concern, and through the goddess's senses she felt that same radiating love, though not the same. It was changing, however slowly, that had guided the two of them to this point. From the woman on the ground. "Well." Paya bowed to her as she stepped closer. "Your Grace." Zelda nodded to her, hoping the assassin saw the particular angle of her head, the implied difference in their elevation and status. Now the two of them would put on a show. Each understood, without having spoken it aloud, this woman had to be shown a goddess and her handmaiden. For a woman it was. Zelda knew her, had known her from the moment Mitha had lifted her out of death.
"We have met before,"
she said, kneeling next to the Yiga. With golden hands she reached for the wounded woman's head, and though Paya was instantly at her side, they both knew there was no threat. Both hands were clasped tightly around the woman's leg, stymieing the flow of blood, and she bore no weapon near. Gently, slowly, Zelda took hold of the Yiga mask, the inverted symbol of the Eye of Hylia, and lifted it from the woman's face.
"It had been some time since we met outside of Kakariko."
The assassin's lips were drawn back from her teeth in pain and panic, but she was still in the way people are still if they know their lives hang by a single, precious thread. There was a desire to harm radiating from her, as sure and even as the heat of the air around them, but no intent. The intent had been driven out of her. The wound on her leg was bleeding. Still, Pai had struck to disable, but without medical attention the assassin would surely bleed to death. Zelda could see that with her naked eye. Mitha's power inside of her was cool, and calming, and empty.
"It draws on my life force," Mitha said. "It has been only minutes. Not enough to work with.
But her life force was not her own, at least not solely. She was not limited in the same ways that another person, or even one of the champions, might be. In her thought she reached out with the goddess's power, and Mitha's grace was like a chalice that stood empty. The power was a molten light, running off her fingers like shining liquid gold, and because she knew it would work she channeled some part of that flow into the grace. The chalice was filled, the chalice ran over. Inside of herself, she felt Mitha gasp in surprise and something very like delight.
"Considerably less than 30 hours,
she allowed herself to think, and then she laid her hands on the wounded assassin's leg. The woman gasped as if struck, and Pai was now next to her, kneeling on the side opposite Zelda, sword laid across her knees, staring into the killer's eyes. But the assassin had no sense that Paya was there. She stared at Zelda's face, eyes wide, and now tears began to flow. Using Mitha's power was much like receiving it, cool and calming, and putting balm to the hurts of the spirit. Was it the goddess's awareness that made it so easy? A century ago, Mitha had said she was helped by thinking of the people she loved. Zelda wondered if, leveraging only her own power and with her own will, she would need such thoughts, too. She did not, for now. Zelda took her hands away, and the Yiga lifted hers too. The wound was closed, sinew and muscle joined once more to bone that was covered in whole, and mock flesh. It was as if the wound had never been made at all. They too stared at it, while Pai's eyes were ever on the assassin's face. Zelda let go of the golden power, and when she spoke again it was in her own voice.
"I think you had better go."
"What?" The assassin. Here she reflected. She did not know the woman's name, did not want to, did not ever intend to, stared at her with shock and something like horror.
"What do you mean?" "Your Grace,"
Paya said,
"that may be too kind. If this woman leaves here uninjured,
because breaking her arms was a viable solution,
then she will attempt to kill you again. Failing that, she will only kill herself for having failed her master."
The object of their conversation did not confirm or even deny. She simply looked back and forth between her captors. Zelda shook her head.
"She will not. She cannot. Look at me."
And the woman did as commanded.
"Do you believe that you, as you are, can kill me, as I am?"
How wrong it felt to say these things. The assassin stared at Zelda, unblinking, and then looked at her own hands, at the closed wound on her leg. Her eyes wandered until they found her weapon on the ground some 10 meters away, which made Paya shift her weight again. Finally, once more, she looked to Zelda.
"No. Then you will not try again, I hope. More, you cannot die by your own hand. If you are still loyal to Ganon and to your clan, then you must return to them and tell them what you have seen, that I am the color of dragons, that I cannot be felled by arrow or blade or blows of force. If you were to take up your sword now and with it open my throat, the wound would close before my blood kissed the air. There is no blow so terrible, no cut so deep, that I would fall from it."
Silence. Then,
"And if I am not loyal? If I betray my people, and the God we serve? Then you would leave, and you would hide, and you would make sure that your fellows cannot find you. Perhaps you would submit yourself to the mercies of the Shaker, I do not know. I cannot dictate your course for you, though I hope it is not one steeped in darkness. Still, you should go, and you should go now.
Silence once more. Zelda rose, and Paya with her, and the two of them stepped away from the assassin, to give her space, though Paya stayed between the other two. She stared at them, like a wary animal, and slowly rose to her feet. She licked her lips, looked down at her leg once more, tested it, to make sure it was whole, and, once she was sure, she made signs with her hands. Orange light encircled her, and then she was gone, smoke marking the place where she had been standing a moment before. The background noise of Death Mountain reigned again, the bubbling of lava and the hiss of the air. Zelda let out a breath she had not realized she'd been holding. Without the goddess's power, she was so much less sure of herself.
That could have gone worse, I suppose.
Paya's embrace was so sudden she didn't realize what was happening until the silver-haired woman had buried her face against Zelda's shoulder and dissolved into sobs that shook her entire body. In the removed, analytical part of her mind, Zelda recognized that the fact that Paya had gone so far as to physically touch her was a measure of the pain and fear and grief she had been feeling before. In the more immediate, responsive part, all she could do was return the embrace. Paya's legs were shaky, and instead of trying to hold her up, Zelda just controlled their descent as they both sank to their knees. She stroked Paya's back and her hair, not knowing what else to do.
There. I'm sorry. I'm alright. I promise I'm alright.
Paya,
you're pinching my hair. If I don't hold your hair against you, it's going to catch fire egg.
And that was about as far as she got before the words got away from her completely. It passed, as one might expect. For being caught in an attack that neither of them had foreseen from an enemy they had assumed incapacitated, each outwardly agreed to mutual blamelessness while quietly blaming themselves. Zelda rebound her hair underneath her climber's bandana, and Paya promised that she would trim the burnt ends once they were stopped for the evening. Up the mountain they continued, eating up the kilometers to Goron City. There were monsters, and these they avoided or killed. There were animals, adapted to the harsh climate of Death Mountain, and these they catalogued. They would have hunted, but neither had the heart to make still more death with her hands. There was a guardian, and this Zelda set to clearing the mountainside of monsters. The sounds of its weapons discharging behind them lent them a sense of security, as if it specifically had their backs. Perhaps it did. Perhaps guardians, like dragons, knew the force that they served. They came to Goron City, in time. They bore witness to the trials of Yunobo and participated in the repelling of Far Redonia. Much happened, and will be outlined in its time. For a moment, just for a moment, followed the Yiga women, who fled on sure feet to the south and the west. Yiga training was not the same as that afforded to warriors of the Shaker. In the many thousands of years since their split, they had differentiated themselves in key ways. The Shaker produced better fighters, the Yiga better assassins. One way in which they had not drifted much, however, was in the essential and fundamental honing of their hearts and lungs. Warriors or messengers of the Yiga and Shaker alike were trained so that they could run at speeds that would be a sprint for any other person, and they could sustain those speeds for a dozen hours or more. In this way, a determined messenger or killer of the Yiga clan might cross Hyrule more swiftly than a rider on a stout horse. So, the killer ran. Zelda never learned her name, nor did Paya, but they knew her face, and Paya especially would have recognized the awe and fear in her expression as she left a wide berth around Hyrule Castle, truly a holy place where the holy rebirth was ongoing. No Yiga was allowed there. Not since Koga had made his pilgrimage. He had told his followers that the god was not given to fools and would seek out the faithful when the time came. Though, she avoided it. And she listened to the sound of steel ringing from miles away, to a voice raised in song that made her heart pound in her chest, and she wondered at the color of the light that shone from the highest tower. And she ran. For days she ran, pushing her body to utmost extremity, when Zelda called upon the fullness of the power of the goddess and Ganon screamed its vengeance from the heart of the kingdom. She was crossing the pass into the Gerudo Highlands. No Yiga approached from the road that lead into the desert. That place was for deployment, or intruders who wished to be feathered by Yiga arrows. It was a testament to her strength that she made it at all. She had stopped to rest only very little and was not sure if she had slept. She was received by her sergeant, who began to ask her what had happened to the rest of her unit, and she responded with,
"I must speak with Master Koga."
The conviction in her words carried the terror of what she'd seen. Her sergeant looked at her in grim consideration, and nodded, and she was brought further into the fortress. That she had been delayed at all was a bad sign. Possibly she would have been killed if she did not have important news. That did not matter now, though. All Yiga of rank were allowed to roam the fortress freely. It was only Master Koga's personal chambers that one needed special permission to enter. She kneeled outside of her master's doorway, assuming the full obeisance. A curtain of beads separated his room from the hallway, but a pall of darkness clung to those beads, making them as opaque as ink, or smoke, or the malice.
Master Koga,
she said, and in spite of her exhaustion and her terror and the weight of the visions she carried in her memory, her voice did not tremble.
I come bearing news that I must share with you.
News. Koga's voice from inside of the room was high, almost relaxed, and conveyed that he would have preferred to use many more words but often restrained himself.
Where have you been, disciple? My master, I have just returned from Death Mountain. I am the last survivor of the band that sought to spill the Princess of Hyrule's blood on the southern slopes.
Silence, more than silence, being near to Master Koga made it possible to feel his moods, as if he could convey them through the air like the smell of incense. The tension weighed on her like a smothering blanket, pressing her down harder onto the floor, and she wondered in a very distracted way what would happen if she passed out from exhaustion and stress.
Enter,
he said. She rose to her feet, bowed formally once more to the closed door, and took the beads in her hands. They were heavier than they looked, crackling with black and purple energies that stuck to her fingers like oil from fatty meat, and they resisted as she pulled them aside, as if trying to retain their current arrangement. Pull them aside she did, and she bowed her head as she entered Koga's chambers. The room was full of malice, as it had been for years. Great golden eyes turned to examine her as she entered, staring and blinking. The walls were occasionally dotted by lipless mouths attached to no throats, that opened and closed and hummed in a language that she did not understand. The light in the room was the light of the malice itself, dark purple from the otherworldly fires and gold from the staring eyes. Koga's bed was untouched. The mat on which he kneeled was untouched. The path from mat to doorway was untouched. Everything else was enrobed in inky darkness. Koga faced away from her, kneeling in contemplation of a design on the wall that connected to the ritual grounds outside, and she could not look at the design because the shape it made hurt her eyes. Instead, she looked at the head of the Yiga. He was not a tall man, but no one would ever gainsay his strength of presence. He rose slowly, placing his right hand on his right knee to push himself into a standing position. Her first instinct was to go to him and help him to his feet. She thought better of it, though, knowing how sacred his mat was considered. There was no fat on him, though there was something else, and when he got to his feet the lean musculature of his back writhed as if something under his skin desperately wished to push into the open air. A faint vapor emanated from his sleeves and his collar. Standing in that room with him, she wondered how she might ever lose faith. She wondered how the servants of the Lyre Goddess could ever think such a thing possible. Here was power personified. He turned to look at her, and for the first time in years she was face to face with Koga, leader of the Yiga, keeper of the last secrets, bearer of the mark of Ganon's favor. Light shone from beneath the pearlescent whiteness of his mask.
Tell me what you saw.